Okay, so guys, you've seen a topic that's taken all of us by a storm. It's that a coronavirus vaccine is finally in the market, and apparently it's 90% effective. So stay tuned. Hey, what's up, guys? It's Confessions of a Doctorholic with Hafsa Slayman. And on air today, I've got the guy who knows kind of everything. Like, you should see his Facebook statuses. I've got Dennis on air. The question that I've got for you, and the question that's like on everyone's mind at the moment is, would you get the coronavirus vaccine? But we're going to answer this at the end of the show. For now, Dennis, are you pro or anti-vaccinations?
Pro, 100%.
All medical students are pro-vaccines, I reckon. I mean, there are a couple here and there, but like...
We have to be. We couldn't be in med school and be in the hospital placements where we are without actually getting vaccines and boosters. I don't know if you remember, but before the first 2 years, we had to submit proof of vaccinations. We had to go to our doctors, get like our vaccination records from when we were 4 or 5 years old. And they would check to see if we were vaccinated wherever we all came from.
Oh, true. And if you haven't gotten vaccinated, you had to get boosters and stuff to get the vaccines. I do remember that now.
That's right.
So for those of you who don't know what vaccines are about, vaccines are basically injections that they give you. There are parts of or like dying bacteria and viruses that can still cause an immune reaction in your body. So essentially, it's not as severe as the actual condition, but it helps your body form antibodies and form an immune response so that if, God forbid, you do get that condition, your body can react and get in there twice as hard.
The real interesting question is the whole anti-vaxxer movement, how that's going to play out with this COVID vaccine, especially given how horrible COVID is.
Yeah, and there's so many myths that is associated with vaccines. So what's our myth number one?
So I think myth number one, and the most famous one, is the MMR, measles, mumps, rubella, autism hoax. So yeah, we've all heard about that. It's this famous 1998 study by former Dr. Andrew Wakefield, who claimed that he found bits of the MMR vaccine in the intestines of kids with autism. So essentially, the study was then repeated and found to use falsified data, and it was discredited by the research community. Fortunately, there was a huge uproar in the media, and this was right around the time that the internet was kind of coming into its own. So we weren't really good at filtering information on the internet, and it helped
spread. I did not know that.
Yeah, and it actually helped spread this kind of anti-vaccine propaganda. And what followed was a bunch of people refusing to vaccinate their kids against measles, mumps, and rubella. And
it's still a problem.
Yeah,
it's still a problem
persists.
until now. It's crazy. And bottom line, like, this guy lied about his data. So, like, it was never a thing. It was never a thing, and people believed it. Having said that, do you follow any anti-vaxxer pages on Facebook?
No, I imagine they're boatloads of fun, but I don't. Given how reactive I am to things on Facebook, it probably would not end well. I'd probably be banned within a day.
Oh my God, my best friend sends me some of the things that they say on there, and oh my God. There are so many things that just do not make sense. It has zero logical sense, and yet so many people believe it. And I feel like most of the comments is just people laughing like they think it's a joke. But some people actually believe that vaccinations are bad for you.
Well, it's a joke until it isn't. It's not just that, say, a parent refuses to vaccinate their kid and their kid is the only one that gets sick. I mean, their kid can become a vector for the condition that they're being vaccinated against. Even if the kid themselves doesn't get any of the horrible consequences of something like measles, they're basically a walking, talking, breathing measles spreader.
I mean, if you get the vaccines done, then like one major advantage for us is that if we get that infection, it's not going to be as severe. But the second thing that you brought up is herd immunity. So for those of you who haven't heard about that, basically with herd immunity, there are people in our population who can't take vaccinations because they have zero immune response. They just don't have the cells, or they have some intense condition and they can't take any vaccinations. So basically, we are kind of doing them a favor, because if all of us get vaccinated and we don't get sick, then we're also saving their lives, which I'm pro. Like, I know some people are kind of like, oh, like, but why should we care? But I feel like if everyone cares about everyone, then we wouldn't have a problem in the world. And that's my corniness for the day.
Is that written on your coffee cup?
No, I don't drink coffee, Dennis. What are you on about?
Well, it's still a coffee cup, even if you drink tea out of it or something. It doesn't change what the cup
true.
is.
I didn't think of that. Now that we're talking about vaccinations, like, what is the process that goes into it?
Okay, so most vaccines and most research into any kind of medication happens in the United States. So the governing body that usually okays drugs or pharmaceuticals, including vaccines for public use, is the USA Food and Drug Administration, or FDA. So essentially, there's a really lengthy, time-consuming, expensive, and extensive process that is required before a company can say, here, we've made this medication, we've made this drug, and it's safe. So,
and the average is about 15 to 20 years for drugs, for vaccinations.
Yeah, the development is slow. So this COVID vaccine is actually pretty unique in how quickly it's been developed. And I think we get to talk about that a little bit later. But essentially, for any kind of medication, any vaccine, any drug, you go through what are called preclinical and then clinical trials. So in preclinical trials, I know there's going to be a few people that are opposed to this, but essentially the early versions of the drug are tested on animals. And this is to test for toxicity, to see how tissue that's similar to human tissue will react to the drug if it's essentially deadly and will kill you. And that's done with a couple animals, possibly isolated cells in a lab, like on a petri dish in culture. But essentially, you need to check that it's not harmful, because we know the first rule of medicine is to do no harm. Then the company has to actually list what they believe the drug will be for. So I guess the classic example of this part being wrong is Viagra. What the company intended it to be for was completely not what it ended up being the most common fix for. In essence, they have to declare this. They have to get approval by the FDA to research this further, and they can actually start clinical trials when the FDA looks and goes, okay, your chemistry, your biochemistry, kind of your physiological theory is correct. Let's see what the actual effects are. So then we go into clinical trials, and these have 3 phases. Phase 1, it's essentially for safety and dosing. You're trying to see how much of the drug you need in an adult, say, to get the therapeutic effect of your drug. And you also want to see how safe it is in humans. So for this, you have a small number of people, usually about 20 to 50 people, and only about 60% or so of the drugs that are tested in phase 1 move on to phase 2. Phase 2 and phase 3, in both cases, you're essentially testing how effective the drug is at doing what it sets out to do. So in the case of the COVID vaccine, we would be testing how many people who received the vaccine and then were exposed to the virus didn't get a serious infection. So phase 2 trials usually work with a couple hundred people, and if that's promising, they can expand it and do a sort of nationwide or larger trial where they get thousands or tens of thousands of people. And that phase 3 clinical trial is really what's going to screen for all those adverse effects, because the bigger your population, the more different they are, the more different their genes. So you're expecting them to essentially respond differently to it, and all the negative responses you can reasonably expect, you would hope that you would get out of this big sample size. So this COVID vaccine is actually in early phase 3. So the clinical trial that they're quite happy with actually had, I believe, something like 100 people. And out of those 100 people, 90% did not get the infection.
But here's the thing, the coronavirus one, it came out in a year.
Less
than a year. Isn't that like red flags all over the thing? Like, what do you reckon?
I think simply given what we said before, that like the whole process takes years usually. The simple fact that we're in phase 3 just means that, it was proven safe. If it's proven safe, then you don't have to delay it. If you have a clear kind of indication for it, we know it's to prevent COVID infection, you can move into clinical trials. Phase 1, it was safe. They figured out what the dose would be for humans. I mean, I think given that we have had vaccines for other similar viruses, that it's reasonable to expect that they could develop a decent enough dosing regimen.
Yeah.
And then when the company says that they're in phase 3, I would actually say they're closer to phase 2, simply because their sample size isn't even in the hundreds. They just have results from like less than 100 people. So they're saying that they're in phase 3 just because you can get away with that. But realistically, they're in phase 2. Before they're allowed to do anything, they have to do more massive trials.
It's also probably something for the media. Like, it sounds heaps better if you go like, oh, it's like in clinical phase 3 trials, rather than being like, oh, we're actually at the start and it looks promising. But here's the thing, like, to be honest with you, I was a little bit skeptical about it because now when you take 15 to 20 years or whatever to form a drug, you can tell over a long period of time if there are long-term effects of a drug. Now, when a drug is formed in like less than a year, okay, I guess you don't get any acute reactions, but you don't know if you're going to have long-term effects. And I feel like the only thing that is making me feel slightly better about the situation is that apparently back in the day, the MERS virus and the SARS virus, which is genetically quite similar to COVID-19, those two viruses, they were developing vaccines for them. They've done phase trials and stuff, or I don't know what stage they've gotten with those, but basically they were looking at ways to make vaccinations for them. So they kind of picked up the research from there. And basically from what I've read, I believe that they are using the crown because like basically coronavirus, it looks a bit like a crown because of a protein called the P protein. And your body develops an immune response against this P protein. I don't know, like it makes sense. But then at the same time in my head, I'm just like, but it's less than a year. And like usually it takes 15 to 20 years. So like, I don't know how I feel about that.
I think that we have to also remember that when we say 15, 20 years, we mean when they start from absolute scratch. So a good chunk of those like 15 to 20 years are actually spent simply getting kind of the exact molecule with the exact, functional group on it, so that it will work the way that it's supposed to in the body.
That's true. If,
like you've said, they had almost templates for other coronaviruses, then it's not a stretch to say, okay, they just adapted it a little bit. They knew exactly what they would need to change to kind of hope that it would target the coronavirus that we're dealing with right now.
Yeah, I agree with you. Did they skip any trials though? Because I feel like they skipped phase 1.
I would actually say they probably did. I don't want to slander them for no reason. Given that their group size, they're kind of combining phase 1 and phase 2 together.
Phase 1 and 2 together, yes, I agree with that.
Especially given that the drug itself has no direct effects. It's mostly supposed to be preventative. So you would assume that it has to be safe if they're going to administer it in the first place.
Like, I was thinking about this for a while now. Whichever country comes up with the first vaccine, they're going to be the leaders, as in like economically, because everyone's going to be buying from them. And because everyone wants this vaccine, they're going to have so much money. So at the moment, this vaccine has been made by Pfizer. And what was the other company?
Pfizer essentially is the American company, but they're also partnered with the German company, BioNTech. It's a mouthful. And actually, the question of funding raises a few more red flags for me than does the whole development process, because essentially, like with everything to do with COVID, politics has really worked its way into the discussion.
Yeah.
And simply because it's not just an American issue, it's a global issue, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Especially now we have international corporations being involved in the creation of this vaccine. So in the US, at least, the Trump administration frequently spent like tons of time discussing how a vaccine would be developed. They launched Operation Warp Speed, which was essentially them giving large sums of money or promising large-scale purchases of a vaccine should it be developed by the end of the year.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there was criticism that this was just kind of a ploy to have a really good result before the election. There was concerns that simply forcing that this would incentivize pharmaceutical companies to, like you said, skip some parts of the clinical trial process and ultimately put out a drug that isn't safe. Interestingly enough, Pfizer itself says they didn't participate in Operation Warp Speed, so they didn't sign any kind of big agreement or promise to deliver anything by the end of the year, unlike some of their competitors. But the US government did purchase $1.95 billion worth of vaccines. So that's about 100 million doses from the first batch. So that would vaccinate about 1/3 of the US population if need be. I don't know about you, but I think $1.95 billion is probably incentive enough to work a little bit harder. And it also makes logistically and fund-wise, it more feasible to do this with the speed that they have.
To be honest, when people start talking millions, billions, whatever, like literally my mind starts blanking out because I'm like, I can't even imagine. I can't even imagine that much money in coins or cash or anything. So I just kind of like go like, okay, that's a shit ton of money, but like, how much money is it really,
I mean, I just imagine an A380 full of like cartons upon cartons of the COVID vaccine, and I just subtract the cost of the airplane, which itself is like what $100 million, and then what you're left with is just what 1.95 billion looks like. Here's actually the other neat trick. So BioNTech, which we mentioned before, is Pfizer's German partner. They received funding from the German government. They got something like 375 million euros from the German government to help develop the vaccine. So you could get into questions like who should get the earlier batches, because the US obviously intends to get the first 100 million batches that are produced, but Germany can say, okay, we also funded this research project, so we should get some of that.
But I also feel like from the German perspective, right, if they spent that much money, then I feel like it wouldn't be a stretch to get some money back so that you can make up for the amounts that you've spent. Like sort of classic, like, profit situation.
This is exactly the point where you can't escape the politics that ultimately come with this virus. I think everyone's eyes have been pretty much glued to the US in terms of political theater. It came up in the vice presidential debate where there was doubt cast on the safety of the vaccine should it be produced successfully. Under the Trump administration's FDA, Senator Kamala Harris said that she would refuse the vaccine if it was recommended by the Trump administration, but would accept it only if it was recommended by, I guess, the Coronavirus Task Force. Even today, when we got the news of the virus, the New York governor, Cuomo, called it bad news that the vaccines, that kind of the study success came out during the Trump administration, and that he wants to stall implementation of their vaccine distribution plan until a Biden administration comes in, just because he thinks they can do a better job. And we have to remember, that's just within one country out of, how many countries are we up to in the world now? 191 that are affected by this virus. So you're going to have similar politics playing out in almost every single nation around the world.
I reckon if they release these vaccines, right, they are going to give it to the people that are at highest risk of exposure.
Right.
So that means it's going to be healthcare professionals. That means it's going to be future us,
Yeah, future us. We're going to be thrown to the wolves, though. We're still lowly med students.
Pretty much. So my question to you is, if they go like, oh, you have to take the vaccine, what would you do?
I would take it. I don't believe that the FDA or any other country's equivalent would approve a drug that would be implemented on this scale. I know we've all heard, especially in science classrooms and in medicine, the horror stories of like thalidomide, which was approved for morning sickness, but ended up giving pregnant women babies with physical defects.
But, limb hypoplasia.
Exactly. Someone's been studying for step one. But when it comes to this, especially given how widely distributed it would have to be, I don't believe that any member of any of these committees would actually take it upon themselves to put out a vaccine that they didn't 100% feel was safe. If something goes wrong with the vaccine that they've developed and gotten paid pretty well for, it's a huge blow for their reputation and their standing in the medical community.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, but then at the same time, I'm not going to lie to you, I am a little bit skeptical, and like best case scenario, I feel like I hope that some people go take the vaccine first so that I can see it and I can go like, oh, okay, they took the vaccine, nothing happened, it's all good, and then I'm happy to take it because I'm pro-vaccinations. But at the moment where we stand, I'm a little bit nervous about the vaccine, just because I would love to think in an ideal world, like, yeah, I do trust the FDA. I usually do trust them. But this time, because there's so much politics and stuff associated with it as well, I'm just a little bit more skeptical. And to be honest, like, I can imagine myself, like, literally first day in the hospital, once we graduate, and they go like, okay, you have to take the vaccine. I feel like mentally I'd be like, oh, do I have to be like the first guinea pig to take the vaccine? But if they go like, oh, like you can't work in the hospital until you take the vaccine, I will 100% take it, because I feel like it's more important to be, like, in my opinion, working and helping people than like being scared of a vaccine.
Okay, I actually have a question for you. So how many people do you think would be a reasonable number to sort of participate in the phase 3 trial to get everybody to be like, okay, the vaccine is safe and effective? I mean, for me, the number would be like several thousand. If they go through like 5
Yeah.
or 6,000, and there's a whole variety of different demographics. So, you have
Yeah.
like, some youth. Okay, I mean, no one's gonna actually test it on children, but if you have enough consenting adults.
No, but
then
here's the
why
thing.
not?
Children don't get an intense reaction from coronavirus. It's mainly older people, and especially elderly and people with comorbidities, right? So I'm kind of happy for them not to do it in kids, to be honest. But I agree with you. There would be many people that probably think of it as, oh, it's safe enough. I'm happy to take it and try it and see how it goes. And if several thousands of people do take it and it's proven safe, I am happy to take the vaccine. But the question is, if I'm here telling you that I'm a little bit skeptical about taking it, who would be the guinea pig to take this vaccine to save us all,
The Pfizer board or the people at the FDA? It's not often you can get people who qualify for the indications of a drug they're certifying, but in this case they would. So if they're confident in the vaccine, I don't see why they'd have a problem going on live TV and getting the shot in the arm.
I'm interested to see how it plays out, I guess.
I actually think it's really important to say that it's really reasonable to be skeptical, especially nowadays when we frequently hear the term follow the science. It makes sense to ask people to show their work. Like I remember in math class, we were always told if you just write in the answer, it's not going to count. You have to show your work. You have to show how you got that magical number at the end. You didn't just copy the person next to you. So I definitely think that it's okay to be skeptical of any vaccine that's put out or any medication that's put out until you can safely point to the evidence that says, here, this is safe and it's effective. I
agree with that. I feel like if there's extensive research that shows me exactly what they did, and they talk about it and they document it, I feel like I'd feel slightly better about it. And especially if they do actually prove going like, oh, this is why we think it works for COVID-19. All right, guys, let us know, what would you do? So if the vaccine comes out, do you want to be guinea pigs? Are you happy to take it? Are you not happy to take it? And I'll catch you next time.